I saw my daughter hesitate when her father reached for her hand, and in that moment, I thought I had already lost both of my children. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't pull away, she didn't cry, she just paused, the way people do when they're calculating risk. Her fingers hovered a fraction of an inch above his, her eyes flicking toward me before settling somewhere neutral, somewhere safe. Then she let him take her hand, and the pause disappeared like it had never existed at all. But I saw it. My chest tightened immediately, not sharp enough to hurt, just heavy, like something had been placed inside me without permission. I kept my expression still. I'd learned how to do that long ago, back when stillness felt like protection instead of surrender. The therapy office smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and old paper. The walls were a muted gray, the kind meant to calm people who came in already agitated. A low bookshelf sat against one wall, filled with books no one ever touched. There was a couch, 2 chairs, and a small table with a box of tissues that felt more symbolic than useful. My son sat beside his sister, knees pulled to his chest, arms wrapped tightly around his shins. He stared at the carpet like it was giving him instructions. He used to ask questions about everything. Now he seemed to be listening for answers he didn't want to hear. I sat in one of the chairs, hands folded in my lap, fingers pressing into my palm hard enough to leave half moons. Across from us sat the therapist, Dr. Nathaniel Rowe, his posture relaxed, his gaze alert. He didn't speak yet. He was watching, measuring. Beside me, my husband, Grant, looked comfortable, not smug, not tense, just at ease. One ankle crossed over the other, hands resting loosely, shoulders relaxed. He looked like a man who had nothing to fear from observation. I didn't look at him. I couldn't afford to. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second landing too loudly in the silence. I focused on my breathing, shallow and controlled. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Enough to stay upright. Something had already gone wrong long before this room. I could feel it in the distance between my children and me, in the way their bodies angled subtly away, like they were bracing for something. My thoughts spiraled inward. What has he been telling them? How long has this been happening? What do they believe about me now? I searched myself for reasons, for moments that could have been twisted into evidence. The nights I cried after they went to bed, the times I raised my voice when I was overwhelmed, the days I couldn't get out of bed fast enough to keep up with their energy. Maybe I made this easy for him. Dr. Rowe finally spoke, his voice calm, neutral, almost gentle. He asked simple questions at first: how school was going, what the kids liked to do on weekends, who helped with homework. Grant answered easily, smoothly, filling the room with reassuring language. He painted himself as attentive, patient, deeply concerned. When it was my turn, I kept my responses short, factual, unemotional. I could feel Grant's presence beside me, steady and confident, like he knew exactly how this would go. Then Dr. Rowe asked him to describe his concerns. Grant sighed softly, like the weight of responsibility had been placed unfairly on his shoulders. "I'm worried about the kids," he said. "I've noticed they get anxious around her. She doesn't always seem stable." The word landed hard, even though he said it gently. My daughter's shoulders tensed. My son's grip tightened around his legs. Dr. Rowe nodded and wrote something down. "Can you explain what you mean by unstable?" Grant hesitated just long enough to appear thoughtful. "Emotionally unpredictable," he said. "She gets overwhelmed, she cries, she panics. The kids don't know what version of her they're going to get." I felt heat rise in my chest, but I stayed still. If I spoke now, it would only confirm the picture he was painting. "And you've discussed this with the children?" Dr. Rowe asked. Grant nodded. "I believe in honesty. They deserve to understand what's happening. I don't want them to be scared." The irony nearly took my breath away. Dr. Rowe's pen paused. He looked up, his gaze moving from Grant to the children, then to me. Something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable. Curiosity sharpened into focus. I felt it then. Not relief, not vindication, awareness. This wasn't confusion, it was construction, a story built carefully over time, reinforced with repetition and concern, and just enough truth to make it believable. and for the first time, someone else was seeing the structure. The sessions continued weekly. Grant never changed his tone. He was always calm, always reasonable. He never called me names outright. He framed everything as fear for the children's safety, concern for their emotional well-being. I said less than I wanted to. I let silence exist. I watched. Rowe asked Grant to give examples. Grant spoke in generalities, feelings, impressions, rarely specifics. Dr. Rowe asked the children how they felt around me. Their answers were careful. "Daddy says Mommy gets confused," my son said one day, staring at the floor. Dr. Rowe looked up sharply. "Confused how?" He shrugged. "Like she doesn't know what's real." I felt my stomach drop. Dr. Rowe wrote for a long time that session. My daughter grew quieter with each visit. Then one afternoon, she asked a question without looking at her father. "Am I bad for missing my mom?" she whispered. Grant's body went rigid. Dr. Rowe didn't answer immediately. "Why would you think that?" he asked. She swallowed. "Daddy says when I miss her, it means she's controlling me." Grant spoke quickly. "That's not what I meant." Dr. Rowe raised a hand. The room froze. I felt my hands begin to shake. 2 days later, Grant filed for emergency custody. The papers arrived in a thick envelope, heavy with language that painted me as unstable, dangerous, unpredictable. He cited escalating psychological episodes, emotional harm, risk. I read them without crying. I called my attorney, Simone Hinnell, who listened quietly as I spoke. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. "This is serious," she said. "We're going to need strong evidence." "I think we have it," I replied. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following week. The courtroom was cold and smelled faintly of disinfectant. Grant sat at his table with his attorney, posture relaxed, expression composed. He nodded to people he recognized, confident in his narrative. I sat beside Simone, hands folded, heart steady in a way that surprised me. Dr. Rowe entered and took his seat. Grant's confidence wavered, just slightly. When Dr. Rowe was sworn in, the room seemed to lean forward. He spoke clearly, methodically, outlining months of observation. He described patterns of language, repeated framing, subtle reinforcement of fear. He explained how children internalize narratives presented as protection. Grant's attorney objected. The judge overruled. Then Dr. Rowe did something no one expected. He turned to the children. He handed them copies of his notes. Not accusations, observations, written records of what had been said, how often, in what context. My daughter read silently, her brow furrowing. My son followed along, slower, his lips moving as he read. Then my daughter looked up at her father. "You told me Mom was dangerous," she said quietly. Grant opened his mouth. No sound came out. The room held its breath. And in that silence, everything changed. The silence after my daughter spoke felt heavier than any sound that had come before it. It wasn't dramatic, no gasps, no raised voices, just a vacuum where certainty used to live. Grant's attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but Grant didn't move. His eyes were fixed on our daughter, wide in a way I had never seen before. Not angry, not calculating, exposed. Dr. Rowe stood calmly, hands folded, waiting. He hadn't raised his voice once. He didn't need to. The judge cleared his throat. "Dr. Rowe," he said, "please continue." Dr. Rowe nodded. "Your Honor, what the children are reading are not interpretations. They are verbatim records of language used repeatedly by their father in both therapeutic and non-therapeutic contexts. My role was not to intervene prematurely, but to observe whether these statements formed a consistent pattern indicative of parental alienation." Grant's attorney stood. "Objection. Speculative diagnosis." Dr. Rowe didn't react. The judge didn't hesitate. Overruled. Dr. Rowe continued. "Children are highly susceptible to emotional framing by trusted authority figures. When one parent consistently describes the other as unstable, dangerous, or unreliable, even without overt aggression, the children begin to internalize fear as a form of loyalty." My son looked down at the papers in his hands, his grip tightening. His foot bounced nervously against the floor. Dr. Rowe turned slightly toward him. "You don't have to read anymore if you don't want to." My son shook his head. "I want to." Grant's face drained of color. Dr. Rowe resumed, detailing how Grant's language escalated over time, how concern shifted subtly into warning, how reassurance became conditional. He described emotional triangulation, the slow erosion of trust, the creation of an implicit rule that loving their mother was unsafe. The courtroom listened. Grant finally found his voice. "This is ridiculous," he said, standing abruptly. "I was protecting my kids." The judge raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Calder." Grant sat, his movements stiff, his composure cracking at the edges. Dr. Rowe reached into his folder and removed another document. "In addition to session notes, I conducted a psychological risk assessment. Based on my findings, I believe the children are experiencing anxiety symptoms consistent with chronic emotional pressure. Not from their mother, but from the narrative constructed around her." My chest felt tight, but this time it wasn't crushing. It was grounding, solid. The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And your recommendation?" Dr. Rowe didn't hesitate. "Immediate cessation of unsupervised influence by the father until corrective therapeutic intervention can occur. Continued primary custody with the mother with monitored visitation." Grant's attorney objected again, louder this time, but it didn't matter. The room had already shifted. The judge looked at the children. "Lila, Marcus," he said gently, "do you feel safe with your mother?" My daughter answered first, "Yes." My son nodded, "Yes." Grant made a sound then, a small, strangled noise, like disbelief colliding with reality. The judge exhaled slowly. "Emergency custody is denied," he said. "Primary physical custody remains with the mother. Visitation will be supervised, pending further evaluation." Grant slumped back in his chair. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't react at all. Because this wasn't a victory. It was a reckoning. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not peaceful, just stripped down, honest. The children came home differently. Cautious at first, testing, watching my reactions like they were relearning something they'd been warned against. I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand reassurance. I let the space exist. Slowly, they filled it. Lila started sitting closer to me on the couch. Marcus began talking again, narrating his thoughts in half-finished sentences, like he was practicing how much of himself he was allowed to share. Therapy continued, this time focused on repair. Dr. Rowe worked carefully, helping them separate fear from fact, guilt from loyalty. Grant attended his sessions stiffly, defensive at first, then angry, then quiet. He didn't apologize, not directly, but something in him changed. The performance dropped away, leaving a man forced to confront the consequences of his own construction. One afternoon, weeks later, Lila handed me a piece of paper. It was one of Dr. Rowe's notes, a copy she'd asked to keep. "I want to remember," she said, "so I don't forget what's real." I folded it carefully and put it away. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, not tense, just still. I thought about how close I'd come to losing them without ever understanding why, how easily truth can be bent when fear is disguised as love, how silence can feel like safety until it becomes a weapon. And I understood something then that I hadn't before. Power doesn't come from proving you're right. It comes from refusing to let someone else define your reality. Once that line is crossed, there is no going back.
You've just stepped into her revenge side, where every wound finds its justice, and every silence ends with truth. If her story struck a chord, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Another secret waits in the next video. See how her revenge begins.